In Moscow City, 1969, a student named Ivan Ivanov was murdered. His corpse found in a park pond with a bullet wound through the head. As it turned out, he had been a member of a socialist revolutionary group and had been killed by his fellow conspirators. The leader of this revolutionary cell, Sergei Neshayev, escaped abroad, but during the investigation, the group connected to him was discovered, and a treatise written by Sergei Neshayev called Catechism of a Revolution was unearthed. In this manifesto of sorts, Sergei wrote on the proper mindset for a revolutionary, writing that the ideal revolutionary is a man with no personal interests, no feelings, no attachments, no property, and no name. He should have made a total break from the laws, traditions, conventions, and values of the society in which he lives, with all of his activity directed towards its total destruction. This goal, his sole passion, dictates utter ruthlessness in his relations with others. It turned out that Ivanov had been murdered out of suspicion that he was a traitor to the cause. Now, Dostoevsky heard about this case in Russia. He was fascinated and shocked by it. And so this inspired him to write the novel Devils. Now this video is going to contain spoilers for the Dostoevsky novel Devils. That being said, you can never really spoil a Dostoevsky novel because they're great to reread. And there's a lot more to these books than simply the events of the plot. But anyway, I would encourage you to read this book yourself. I have it here with me. And without further ado, let's get on with the video. Now this story has a very mysterious air throughout most of it, and at the center of this mystery is Nikolai Stavrogin, a character whose essence is quite elusive for most of the novel. He's essentially an intelligent, good-looking, tall young man from an aristocratic background, son of the very wealthy and well-respected Varvara Petrovna, and educated by Stefan Trofimovich, a sort of liberal academic scholar of the town. Now, Nikolai Stavrogin was a well-respected individual, an officer in the military, but we hear that he started to go off the rails a little bit. This has resulted in him being demoted from his rank, following 2 duels he participated in, and within one he killed a man. He's been said to have been associating with the absolute worst degenerates of society in St. Petersburg, and eventually gave up his post as an officer and started living a life of debauchery. This is until he returns to the small town in which this novel's set, and becomes involved in a few interesting incidents. The first involved a harmless elderly gentleman at some sort of social function. Now this man had a habit of saying, "You can't lead me by the nose." And so one time when he uttered his famous phrase, Stavrogin decided to go and pull him across the room by the nose. And the second incident involved the governor of the town, when Stavrogin leaned in to whisper a secret to him, but instead of whispering the secret, he bit the man on the ear. Now at this point in the story, it's widely believed that Stavrogin's bizarre behavior is the result of illness. But as the reader, you can sense that there's something more to Stavrogin. He just has a very mysterious aura around him, but it isn't until later in the story that we're exposed to his nihilistic philosophy and the full depths of his mind. So in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the mind, philosophy, and psychology of Nikolai Stavrogin, of Dostoevsky's Devils. Now as mentioned, Stavrogin was entirely educated by Stefan Trofimovich, a sort of stereotypical liberal academic who had been heavily influenced by the trendy Western ideas at the time, the atheism, the liberalism, the socialism, the materialism, which had been heavily influencing the Russian intellectual class at the time. These ideas were becoming fashionable in Russia, but scholars like Stefan Trofimovich were not raised on these ideas. They were raised in traditional Russian Orthodox Christian society, and then later in life, as scholars, were exposed to this new intellectual trend of atheist materialism and liberalism. Stefan himself is an atheist and a vague sort of idealistic liberal. He loves literature and art and beauty, but he hasn't fully committed to the logical conclusions of his atheist worldview, since his psychological foundations were forged within a religious context. He still, therefore, retains traditional notions of good and evil, and feels their force on his psychology and his behavior. His roots are essentially non-atheistic, and so he is tethered to the Christian ideals traditional in Russia. But what would happen when we have a new generation who are raised on these ideas, and so are prepared to really live them and take them to their logical conclusions? The young generation, on the other hand, when raised by this kind of atheistic, materialistic idea, lack that moral foundation. And they then do what could either be thought of as bastardizing the ideas of someone like Stefan Trofimovich, something that he himself complains about regularly throughout the book. But on the other hand, perhaps what's really going on and what makes people like Stefan so uncomfortable is that these young people are simply taking atheism and materialism to its logical conclusions. After all, without God, what is the basis for people like Stefan's adherence to traditional moral norms? What would make it truly wrong, for instance, for the socialist revolutionaries that the novel is centered around to kill in service of their aims? Stefan agrees with the socialistic cause, but he would firmly draw the line at killing as part of any sort of violent revolution. But Dostoevsky shows that a young generation raised on atheism, materialism, liberalism, for them everything is permitted. They will lack the moral foundation of religion, and to them an aversion to kill in service of their ultimate aims is simply a psychological inconvenience to be overcome. Now, for most of the novel, the reader is left wondering what exactly is going on in Nikolai Stavrogin's mind. So many of his actions strike you as incredibly bizarre, and there's never any immediate or apparent explanation for them. But then later in the novel, during a chapter that was censored for over 100 years, in which some light gets shed on who Nikolai Stavrogin is. This is when he visits a monastery to confess to a retired bishop. He gives this bishop a letter detailing what he got up to in St. Petersburg, including some of his most appalling acts, but importantly, a lot of his psychology that was underlying his decision making. As it turns out, Nikolai Stavrogin embodies the persona and value system that Sergei, the real-life killer and revolutionary, thought would make the ideal revolutionary. Throughout the letter, we get details of various devious and evil acts to varying degrees. And we quickly see that Stavrogin loves to violate the deepest norms of society, just as a kind of experiment to see what will happen, both how other people will react and how it will affect his own psychology. It begins fairly tame, and some of these acts are somewhat trivial. He discusses his romantic involvement with two women who both know each other at the same time, and his plot to engineer a kind of confrontation between the two of them, including one of their husbands. He claimed this would yield the most satisfying results. But this plot was interrupted when something more important captured his attention, and it's here that his confession gradually becomes darker and more sinister. Stavrogin had been renting two different lodgings in order to entertain his two women separately, and one of these was a small room, next to which lived an 11 or 14-year-old girl. Her mother used to thrash this girl, and one time she was being thrashed after being accused of pinching something, but moments after she was thrashed, it appeared, and so she had been thrashed for no reason at all. But right after this, Stavrogin had noticed his penknife was missing, and so he mentioned this to the woman next door just in case she'd happen to see it. He didn't expect that she would blame her daughter, but blame her daughter she did. The moment that Stavrogin expressed that his penknife was missing, the woman immediately started thrashing her daughter again. But just before the thrashing started, Stavrogin had noticed something interesting. His penknife had simply fell off from where he had left it. And he noticed this the moment before the woman started thrashing her daughter, right as she picked up the broom. The moment that he found the penknife, it occurred to him to just say nothing and just let the girl get thrashed anyway. After confessing this, he says, "Whenever in my life I have chanced to find myself in some exceptionally shameful position, some more than usually humiliating, despicable, and above all ridiculous situation, it has always aroused in me not only boundless anger, but at one and the same time an incredible sense of pleasure. He says that he loved the intoxication that came from an agonizing awareness of his own depravity. Stavrogin's confession then reaches a crescendo with his most heinous act of all. The girl that he lived next to that had been wrongfully thrashed on his account was alone one day, and she was terribly shy of Stavrogin. Stavrogin found her alone in her room one day, and so he details how he went in, started kissing her, seduces her, and then has sex with her. Afterwards, she was embarrassed and kind of smiled timidly at him, but he intentionally gave her no reassurance or affection, and just leaves her there confused and ashamed, without saying a thing to her. A few days later, this resulted in the young girl going into a fever, deliriously muttering that she had killed God, feeling incredibly ashamed and guilty for what she thought was her fault, her terrible and shameful act. A day later, it's just her and Stavrogin in the building again, and she brings herself to direct some of her anger and try and reprimand Stavrogin, getting up and standing in his door and shaking her little 11-year-old fist at him. Stavrogin continued to just ignore her and not say a thing, leading her to become so entrenched in her shame and guilt that she ended up committing suicide. She went into the storeroom and hung herself. As she did this, Stavrogin was there, and he had a strong suspicion about what she was doing in that storeroom. But rather than intervening, he decided to check his clock, wait precisely 35 minutes before checking on her. After he patiently waits his 35 minutes, confirms that she had done what he had suspected, he simply leaves the house. Days later, he decides to inflict something revolting upon himself in order to cripple his life. At first, he considered shooting himself, but then he settled on the decision to marry the mentally and physically disabled sister of one of his friends. After all, who could imagine anything more grotesque than a marriage between Stavrogin, intelligent, tall, strong and handsome, and such an abject creature? Now, throughout this entire confession, Stavrogin details an entire list of heinous, immoral acts that he performed. He says he treated one woman even worse than this young girl, Matryoshka, which eventually led to that woman's death too. He killed 2 men in duels who had done absolutely nothing wrong to him, and he also was involved in poisoning someone. But he says that none of these things caused him the internal agony that recalling Matryoshka did. Stavrogin says he's been having mental images of the young, feverish Matryoshka standing at his door and shaking her fist at him, and these visions absolutely torture him. He doesn't even understand why he feels so tortured by it, whether it's a result of conscience and repentance or something else altogether. But very interestingly, he does reveal that these visions of Matryoshka are not involuntary apparitions, but mental images that he himself chooses to conjure up every time. He could stop doing it and banish Matryoshka from his mind for good, but he simply does not want to. And he says that he will continue to torture himself with the mental image of the girl he caused the death of until he goes insane. Now at this point, having listened to all of this, you're probably just wondering, why on earth would Stavrogin do these things? He makes it very clear throughout the confession that he is in full possession of his mental faculties. He is in full possession of his rationality. And he's also an intelligent man. And furthermore, why does he derive pleasure from being in atrocious, humiliating, or depraved situations? And why would he choose to torture himself with mental images of the girl that he caused the suicide of? Well, the answer to all this is the character of Stavrogin and the other characters who he instills ideology into are supposed to represent the logical conclusions of the Enlightenment ideologies developed by the West that had begun to seep into Russia and take hold during Dostoevsky's time. Atheism, the rejection of religion, specifically Russian Orthodoxy, was at the core of this, and undergirds the materialism, the liberalism, the socialism, and eventually the nihilism that Dostoevsky supposed would follow. After all, without God, what is morality besides a fiction created by humanity? All that this fiction represents to the individual are restrictions on his freedom. Morality is like a trap that ensnares people and limits their potential on this view? Isn't the rational choice just to overcome morality and become a kind of self-legislating man-god who has overcome all psychological hurdles? Stavrogin himself is really gripped by his rationalist atheistic worldview, and we see him grappling with the implications of the death of God. And this results in complete indifference to what he does and what happens to him. A good act and an evil act have just become identical to him. What this nihilistic indifference results in for Stavrogin is simply him wanting to assert his independence from morality, his unrestrained nature, by showing that everything is permitted. He simply wants to exercise his freedom, his free will from any moral constraints. And so he does this by intentionally choosing to do the most heinous acts possible. What could express one's freedom from morality, psychological burdens, and God more than breaking the most stringent social and moral taboos and performing the most self-destructive acts? The acts lack any real value, they simply assert a free and transcendent will. And so Stavrogin represents someone who has broken all of the chains that hold back a human. Fear of death, traditional morality, moral concerns of right and wrong, good and evil, in order to become a kind of man-god. Guilt and a conscience are just more psychological burdens to be overcome, just like the Stoics and the Buddhists advocate that we do with our desires. Fear of death is irrational. Without God, there is nothing to experience on the other side. There is nothing to be afraid of. And so suicide becomes the ultimate act of self-will. It represents overcoming the most deep-rooted and universal tendencies and drives of man. But the result of eradicating God, religion, value, fear of death, and all meaning itself is a complete indifference, to the point that philosophical reasoning itself becomes pointless. The nihilistic project becomes self-defeating. When you throw out value, meaning, and morality, you might be able to call yourself free and unrestrained, but the cost is you have nothing positive to drive you, and even your nihilistic project itself becomes meaningless. Now, Stavrogin isn't so much driven by doing what he wants in a kind of hedonistic sense, of trying to secure pleasures and self-interest for himself at the expense of morality. He is more like an experimenter. He simply wants to see what happens when one descends into the depths of depravity, when one overcomes any aversion to the acts we consider the most immoral. Stavrogin himself says that he just feels a complete indifference to everything he ever did. And so he's essentially exploring uncharted territory, the fascinating urge to bend over the abyss and to peep into it. But he becomes so apathetic because in trying everything for the sake of experimentation, he becomes acquainted with the groundlessness of everything, of existence and value. And so he loses any genuine desire or valuation of anything. As he says, he only really finds a bit of pleasure in being in the most bizarre, humiliating and depraved situations, i.e. performing his experiments. Stavrogin gets such deep pleasure from these sorts of abominable acts because it affirms to him that he is the true ruler of himself. He isn't a slave to any external morality, or even the typical norms and expectations of behavior in society. Nor is he a slave to the typical desire to inculcate in others a positive view of oneself. He simply doesn't care if people see him as terrible, although he does care about what people think of him to an extent. And so he fulfills his egoist project of becoming God in some sense, and feels great pleasure at expressing his moral freedom. Now, I say that he does care what people think of him to an extent, because as the retired bishop points out, he's essentially challenging those who read the confession, which, by the way, he intends to print and distribute to everyone he knows, everyone in the town. He essentially is challenging them to hate him. He wants them to hate him and see him as a depraved individual. But it would also bring him some relief if, despite seeing him as so depraved, they were to forgive him in some genuine capacity. But at the same time, he couldn't tolerate the shame that would come from a genuine attempt at atonement. He says that he makes himself appear less likable and more depraved in his confession because he can tolerate their hatred but not their pity, condescension, and laughter. He also can't achieve full repentance because he simply cannot bring himself to believe in any sort of objective standard of good and evil that would make what he did truly bad. He's really in the grips of nihilism. To him, it would be a lie to say that what he did was truly evil. He knows that a genuine forgiveness of the religious kind is what he needs. And he also believes that nations need God and religion as a kind of pragmatic necessity. But this pragmatic view of faith doesn't furnish grounds for him to have faith himself. You can't truly believe in religion just because you think that religion is what you need. That wouldn't be a genuine belief. It would be an attempt at self-delusion. And so this results in a kind of paradoxical worldview, where Stavrogin accepts the psychological necessity of faith, but this view of the matter forbids him from being able to have genuine faith himself, leaving him like a plant without water. The act of publishing this document of his confession is really just an attempt at self-aggrandizement, not a genuine attempt at repentance. Now, as I mentioned, the novel essentially follows a group of socialist revolutionaries, and Stavrogin is somewhat at the heart of all this, although he himself remains disinterested in the political aims of the group throughout the novel. He's just wrapped up in his own exploration of the psychological and philosophical implications of different behaviours and ideas. And so whilst all the members of the group are kind of atheists, nihilist, materialists, arguably Stavrogin is even more entrenched within the logical conclusions of the ideology than the rest. Not only has he abandoned God and objective morality, he's abandoned interest in any political aim also. The world has become a meaningless and purposeless sandbox for him to poke around and explore and see what happens. And once you've got rid of the moral norms that give value and good and evil and beauty to things in the world, and you embrace this full-blown nihilism, you might overcome morality, but you'll have nothing to drive you in a positive sense. You'll merely have indifference. The moral freedom that you think you are going to have ends up not really being freedom at all, and doesn't provide the psychological benefits that you expect. Rather, it leaves one lost, and without any kind of value system, one is left unable to affirm any philosophical position whatsoever.